minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin on the back of a hand begins to freeze in about 10 minutes. Add 15 miles an hour of open prairie wind, and the window closes to 5. Fine control in the fingers goes before a person notices it going. A man can still walk and still talk and no longer work a buckle or hold a knife square to the wood. In the winters of the 1880s, on the northern plains, 2 kinds of shelter stood within a few miles of each other under that same air. One was a settler log cabin. Hewn timber, chinked walls, a stove burning through the night. Settler diaries from those winters record frost on the inside of their own walls, and water frozen solid in a bucket set a few feet from the fire. The other was a Lakota winter camp. Hide lodges, no stove, no chimney, no glass, no milled lumber, no nails. Those lodges held an interior warm enough to sleep in with a fire burned down to embers. Same air, same wind, same night. By every standard the settlers applied themselves, the cabin was the more advanced building. It was also the colder one. I'm Birch. I read shelters the way other people read machines, and this one has 4 moving parts. The cabin had none of them. One of those 4 is the entire reason ice formed on a settler's wall and not on the hide 2 miles away. And I'll tell you which one before the end. The first part is the fire, and it runs backwards. Start where the settler started. Build it bigger. An open fire is not only a heat source, it is a pump. The hot column above it rises and exits, and every cubic foot of air that leaves has to be replaced from outside, under the door, through shrunken chinking between floorboards. A larger fire pumps harder and pulls minus 40 air across the floor faster. It heats your face while the draft it creates cools everything below your knees. It looks like a heat source. It is actually an air exchange rate, and the person feeding the fire is the one setting it. You may know that failure mode from a heated room: warm on one side, cold air at ankle height, a wall pulling heat off your shoulder with the thermostat holding at 70. Same physics in a cabin with a 2-foot hole in the roof. The second instinct fails the same way. Put on more clothing. Insulation doesn't hold heat. It holds still, dry air, and the air does the work. Water conducts heat roughly 25 times better, so a man who overdresses and then splits wood sweats into the layer keeping him alive. Both traps are the same mistake in 2 forms, treating cold as something to overpower. The Lakota, the Blackfoot, and the Inupiat treat it as a rate to control. That control gets built from the ground up, and it starts below the floor. A Lakota winter lodge doesn't start with walls. It starts with the ground because frozen earth pulls heat out of a body faster than cold air does through direct contact, before air temperature enters the problem. If you have ever felt cold come up through a tent floor before it came from anywhere else, you already know why this gets solved first. Dried grass goes down, then hide, breaking that contact before anything above it matters. Because the floor alone isn't enough, sleepers don't rest on it either. A platform of willow or hide is raised a hand's width or more off the ground, which keeps a body out of the coldest air in the lodge, air that always settles lowest, near the floor, regardless of what the fire above is doing. The wall works on the same logic, though it takes longer to see coming. An inner liner staked to the ground and rising 4 or 5 feet up the interior stands a short distance in front of the outer hide rather than touching it. To understand why the fire at the center stays deliberately small, sized to the space rather than pushed for output, you have to see what that liner is doing with the air, which is also the honest place to say that all of this is reconstructed from historical and ethnographic records and explained as engineering. It worked as a complete system, maintained daily by people who knew it. It is not a method to copy. Ground to smoke hole, 4 layers are now doing distinct work. Floor insulation, a raised platform, a liner standing off the outer wall, and a small fire venting through the peak. 3 of those read as restraint. The 4th reads, at first, like an error. Where the liner meets the ground, it isn't sealed. A narrow gap runs the full base of the lodge, left open on purpose. You have probably sealed a draft somewhere in a house for the same reason a settler would have sealed this gap, and the instinct is wrong in both cases for the same underlying reason. Cut off every place air can move, and the moisture a body and its fire produce has nowhere left to go. It collects on the first cold surface it reaches. I have read this same pattern into shelter after shelter, historical and modern. A gap that looks like a builder's mistake and turns out to be the whole mechanism. Cold air enters through that gap because the fire's draft is calling for replacement air, and this is where the design gets deliberate. The channel it enters is narrow, a hand's width between liner and outer hide, running the full height of the wall, and the incoming air is routed up through it rather than into the space where people are sitting. Width matters here. Too wide, and you have a room inside a room with cold air pooling in it. Held narrow, the air moves fast enough to keep climbing, and by the time it reaches the top of that channel, it has picked up warmth from the hide and carries the moisture from breath and cooking out through the smoke hole with it. You would never sit in that draft yourself, and neither does anyone inside the liner. They sit in the pocket it creates, warmed by the fire directly and insulated by a layer of comparatively still air the moving draft never touches. The same principle your clothing runs on, built at the scale of a building. It looks like a leak. It is actually a flue, built into the wall itself, running the full circumference of the structure, which is why the hide overhead never frosts on the inside the way a sealed structure does. That gap is the answer to the question I left open at the start, the one part the cabin didn't have. If it's worth knowing why a wall should be built to move air instead of block it, a like on this exact minute tells the algorithm that the mechanism is what people came for. And that's what gets another one of these made, because the cabin ran on the opposite instinct, and it ran on it hard. Every gap a settler could find he closed. Sealing breath. Cooking steam and snow tracked in at the door behind the same cold surface instead of giving any of it somewhere to go. It condensed on the inside face of the wall and froze there, and that ice then pulled heat out of the room for as long as it remained, regardless of how hard the stove worked against it. Strip away any argument about which people were tougher, and you're left with the actual variable. Material had nothing to do with the outcome. Sawn timber outlasts hide against weather in almost every other respect, and the cabin still lost. Because the problem was never about strength. It was about where the moisture in the air was allowed to go. Out through a deliberate channel or trapped against whatever surface happened to be coldest. The same surface a poorly vented wall in your own house will find today. One structure gave it an exit built into the architecture. The other gave it a wall to freeze on and called the frost bad luck. Neither building needed more fuel to solve this. The lodge stayed warm on a fire a fraction of the size of what the cabin burned through the night because its draft was doing controlled work instead of fighting its own builder's sealing job. There is a second cost to that, and it compounds. Wood on the open plains is not a background resource. It is hauled, often from river bottoms miles off, by people already spending calories to stay warm. A structure that demands a large fire every night doesn't only run colder, it taxes the household that runs it every single day of a winter that can last 6 months. The lodge was engineered to keep that tax low, which is its own kind of design decision, made by people who had to live inside the result. None of that is guesswork you're meant to take on faith. It's Lakota engineering, developed and refined over generations by people solving a specific physical problem in a specific place, and the Lakota Nation continues that knowledge today. Everything worth explaining in this video came from that engineering. None of it came from luck, and none of it came from a harsher people suited to a harsher world, which is what makes the ending of a night like that so unremarkable. The fire goes down to coals. The gap at the base of the wall keeps working, quietly on nobody's attention. A family sleeps, and the storm outside is still doing exactly what it was doing at the start of this video. It just has nothing left to act on. Nobody in that lodge is solving a problem. It was solved generations before that particular storm, by people who were no longer awake to think about it. If a mechanism taken apart this way is worth your time again, subscribing is what puts the next one in front of you. That's the wall. I'm putting the pencil away.